take them down and take them down and take them down, take them down, take them down and take them down and take them down. As you look, the whole room explodes down and thick of you, thick of you, as you look, the whole room explodes down and.
Hey, are you doing good? Alright, what Jan doesn't know is I already stole his bed, so I have now like a double bed that pretty much suits me. As he told you, I'll tell you about AngularJS, and as the tagline of all this is server-side development and rock and roll, and AngularJS is clearly not server-side. It's either rock and roll or I'm like this guy coming to your party even if he's not invited and draining all your beer. We'll see how much rock and roll I can get out of it. So I'm Thorben. If you want to holler at me, just look for Wolski. I'm Wolski at GitHub and Twitter and hope to be Wolski everywhere else, but that's not for sure. As Jan said, I've worked for Engineer in San Francisco for close to a year and then quit them. And right now we are founding Quarter Spiral with two guys from San Francisco and North Carolina. We're doing game publishing for indie developers, like as a service. So if you're an indie game developer, come to me, we should talk. If you want to contact me, that's my email address right there. Okay, you can barely read it, but whatever. It's torben@quarterspiral.com. And this is actually my second talk I have about JavaScript things. The first one was a bit about combining Ruby. I'm coming from a Ruby background, as I guess many of you do too. And that was, I think, 1.5 years ago. And as I did this talk, as I put it together, I came kind of to the same conclusion. In the beginning, there should be some time to enjoy the good old times, enjoy the good memories we have, and reminisce a bit about the whole web development over the last years or last decade maybe. So that's where we are coming from. It's beautiful, ugly websites, and it's pretty shitty, but it was a website. And then at some point, somebody invented or discovered something then called DHTML, and bam, we got all the niceness and cursor trails and whatnot, and everything went pretty shitty pretty soon. But to the rescue, there was things like jQuery and Prototype and I don't know, whatever you want, like Mood tools. That helped us a lot. That made our life a lot better, and I really enjoyed doing that, and I really enjoyed being part of that whole epoch in web development, coming from a very static web application, and then just introducing this little bit of JavaScript and Ajax, and then people tell you, wow, I didn't know that was possible, and you can basically surprise them every day with very little work, which was pretty amazing. I'm sorry. All right. So jQuery is awesome. Made our life a lot easier, and we could work pretty good with it. But as applications grew and grew, at least in the client side of it, so as we put more and more code on the client side to make things more dynamic and just more awesome, things can get hairy with jQuery, which is basically because that's, in essence, pretty raw. There's no structure it's giving to you. There's no guidelines it hands to you. So that basically marks the advent of a lot of other frameworks. So we have Backbone.js, and there's all Ember, Knockout, you name it, whatever. Doesn't really matter what frameworks, but there were a lot of them. And Backbone was maybe the first that got a lot of traction because it was so easy and small. But as I went through them, and I can't say really an Ember expert or a Sprout Core expert or anything like that, but I did some commercial applications with Backbone, and I've at least looked at all of them a little bit, and none of them really stick. Backbone was too little for most of what I wanted. It just didn't provide a lot of benefit on top of jQuery, and then things like Ember or Sprout Core, where there's just so much, where you just have to code your views and do all that crazy stuff. So even if things felt a little bit better and had a little bit more convention, there was not really this, yes, this is the next thing we should all do. But then over time, there was something coming up on the horizon, and which is interesting because normally if awesome things happen, it takes 5 minutes to them to get posted to Hacker News or anywhere else, and you will pretty much notice them. But this was beginning of last year, And nobody told me about that. And I heard it every now and then that there's this new framework thing, but there was no like, you should look at this is so awesome. So I decided after hearing it a little bit, but not hearing too much good things about it, to give it a try and see if it's bad or not, because I didn't hear any bad things about it too. So the thing on the horizon was AngularJS, which is built by the Google guys, and in essence is like a JavaScript MVC, MVVM, whatever you name it thing. So it's a framework for client-side JavaScript applications. And after like working with it for a while, so I started digging into it early last year, and then we're now building lots of quarter spiral on top of AngularJS or using AngularJS. So I've quite some experience with it, and I can say you it is awesome. So you should look at it. But why is that? Like, what's the difference between all these other frameworks that have been around much longer and that did not really stick to what I'm doing? And I think it is the way Angular treats MVC. So if you go to the Angular website, you won't find anything about MVC or MVVM on it, at least on the front page. All it says is AngularJS that's HTML enhanced for web apps. And that's exactly what I think it is. AngularJS takes MVC and puts HTML and the view as the really centerpiece of it. So everything is surrounded around the view or around HTML in particular, which is pretty awesome. We'll see in a minute why. So before we do that, I'll walk you real quick through a breakdown of how AngularJS treats the MVC pattern. So on the model level, they have something called a scope. The scope is basically exactly that. It's a scope of data. And then we have the view, which is HTML, period. So there's no like craziness, no templating language, whatever, blah, blah, blah. You don't have to learn handlebars to do it. It's all HTML. And as you know, say, but I want to write HAML or anything. Yeah, don't worry, because like HAML compiles to HTML, right? You can basically do whatever you want. You can use the complete toolchain you've used for years now, because everything compiles to HTML if it's on the web. So that's pretty awesome. And then there's some controller level, which is really tiny and just glues the scope and the HTML together. All right. Before I talk more about that in theory, let's just jump into it. So this is a page, an Angular page. What it does is not very important, but you enter a key there and you can encrypt and decrypt stuff, blah, blah, blah. It's all client-side. So what is important is that the things marked here, so the red box down there, the red box on the out, and then like the small blue box up there, these are scopes. And just the fact that you can visualize your model, like I can tell you, okay, in this blue box, we have like a model context. So there's data on the page that's only valid within this small box or div up here, which I find pretty amazing. So let's, I've simplified this example. So in the next few steps, I'll walk you through something that is just a text area. You can enter text, and then you can hit a button and it gets encrypted. So forget about the key, forget about the two text boxes, just very simple stuff. So there's the code, it's just HTML, and I'll walk you through it step by step. So maybe I get over here. So first thing we do is we enhance the whole thing with this, what Angular calls a directive. So you say, okay, this div uses this particular controller. In our example, it's an AES encryption controller. And then second step, what we do is okay, we have this text area down here, and we want a particular piece of information to be displayed in the text area. So we tell them, okay, the model of this text area is something called message. What it technically means is in this scope, the controller also like creates a new scope, which is only valid in this div. So in the scope, there's a property called message. Please bind it to the text area. So everything which is in that property will display in the text area. If you change the text area, it will change back in the model. So the message property will change. It's what Angular calls a two-way binding. You will see all that in action a little later. And so last step is, and like ng submit, there are a couple of those things like ng click, ng submit, ng blah, blah, blah. In this case, okay, if the form gets submitted, please encode this text. Especially, we are calling a function called encrypt. So all of that is coupled together in the controller. I've left the important parts of the view up here, and then you will see in the controller first, there's a name mapping, which you can see there. Here's like an initial thing we put into the message property. So the text area will initially be populated with a some message. And then last but not least, there's the encryption method, which in this case just takes whatever is in the property, calls a function and then writes it back. So after you click and after you hit submit, it will just be the encrypted thing in the text area. Okay, that's just a very basic and quick run through of a very simple Angular app. Next thing, which is a more interactive demo, is what is very interesting, how to translate something you've done in jQuery before, and how do you do it now with something like a more powerful tool like Angular. So let's assume we have this simple list, just some clients, and you want to click on some of the clients, and then you get a form to change their data, and that's it. So in jQuery, what you would do is, okay, handle the click at some point with some JavaScript code. Then you got to copy the data from data attributes or whatever, wherever you have them. And in the end, just animate the box to pop up and show those things. So in Angular, things are a little bit different. And this is the time to show you something in action. I hope that works, because I don't know which resolution the thing is. Okay, that shouldn't be too bad. Okay, so what I've opened here is my controller, and the first thing I do is just I add a list of clients in there. So it's very simple. I just have a scope in my controller. I add a property called clients, and then it's just a JavaScript array, and just some plain JavaScript objects will hold the data of my clients, like their first and last name. So I'll shortcut that a little bit, and then we'll jump into the view, which for now is just the header, and then we'll add a list, which is just an HTML list, as you might have already guessed. And then what we do next is adding an li, and within that li, there's a special thing in Angular called ngRepeat, which basically takes a list or some collection. You can also have like objects and stuff, repeats over them, and so what this does is, in here, it creates a new scope. So for each li it creates, for each client in the list of clients, it has a new scope. And in that scope, there's a variable called client set. So what we can do in here is just write the client name in there. This curly brace notation is indeed some strange Angular stuff. So when we run this, you get a list of clients. All right, so that's not like super amazing, but we'll take it to a next step. Wow. So before we go into like details like interaction, I want to introduce something else which is important later, because I think that's really the corner piece of the whole Angular framework thing, which makes it so powerful. So I've introduced a JavaScript like a constructor function, which does nothing very special. It takes the first name and the surname and then puts it into the appropriate properties. And I also add a name function to that. So you can call name and you get back a concatenated string from the first and the last name, which is in itself not very like special at all, but you will see later why it is very, very cool that Angular actually can handle that. So I'll take the list of my clients, and instead of doing like object notation down there, I'll create a new client thing with the first and the last name. And as the new client thing still has the first name and surname properties, we can just run that after this change, and everything will work as before. Okay, amazing. And then now we're going to introduce the name function call in there, which might not look very interesting, but is actually something that not many JavaScript MVC frameworks can do. Here I'm too stupid to do to code, but it will work if I get the syntax right. And I'll tell you why this is so special in a second. So it still works, still the same output, everything still the same, which is kind of expected. Okay, so in the very last step of this demo, we'll do what I promised you, like getting the interaction right. Oh no, fuck. Okay, I fucked it up. So what you can also do is run filters on arrays and shit. So here in this case, I will order my list, and I will not order it by like a static property. I will really order it by the function. So what Angular has to do is call that function all the time and then order the shit by whatever is the output. And if I now run that, it will, you'll see Ben is on top now, Blake is the second, blah, blah, blah. So it orders the list dynamically. And you will see more of that in the last step, which is the real interaction. Okay. No. Okay. Most of it is pretty straightforward as well. So we will just, because we want to click each client to open that form, we'll make a link out of it, and we'll do what we did with the text area before, where we had like ng submit. There's now ng click, which does like handle clicks on on elements. In this case, we are calling a function called focus client, which we have not defined yet. Therefore, nothing is happening if we click on that list. But we're now heading to the controller and adding that function. And now it's interesting because in a jQuery, we would have to copy a lot of data, as I described. What we do in Angular is, I don't know, kind of confusing, I think. So we're just, in the scope, defining a new property. I call that client in focus and set it to the client that got passed in. So there's no data copying. It's just basically pointing to the same thing that is already in the client list. And then we'll check that. First check is just like put something in there to display this client in focus. As it is in the same scope, we can just output the name of it and then reload it, and we see like the focus is clear at first because there's nothing in there, and then when we click things, they will be down there too. So now let's add the form for that to change it actually. I've like the ID and the class I'm adding here, that's just some CSS, blah, 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 so don't pay too much attention to it. There's no Angular meaning for it. So we're adding a div, and then we'll just putting in input fields for the first and last name. Right, and that's very boring. But I can tell you there's a shortcut for the second field, so you just have to watch me writing the first thing. It's just a normal input field, and again, we're binding that input field to the data, so we're using ng model again, which we have used in the examples before. So what I'm telling there is, okay, this input field is actually bound to the client in focus first name. So if there is no client in focus, it's bound to nothing, which is interesting as well, but if there is one, we'll change it. So now that's done, and there's a second thing for the surname, and we can actually refresh the page, and we see the form on the bottom, it's empty, and when we click things, we can see that the data is updated automatically. And as a last interesting thing, we'll now make this beautiful and just use ng class instead of class. You see, ng is like a magical thing, and what this notation does is pretty tricky too. So you have a JavaScript object. So inside there is always like an Angular expression, how they call it, but it boils down to simple script. And in this case, the key is a class, and the value, if the value evaluates to true, it will add that class. So if we have a client in focus, it will have the slide out class. If we don't have a client in focus, there will be no slide out class on that div. And we can use that to our favor when we're now adding a button to close the whole form. So we have a button, and we use an unfocused thing that we'll now define in the controller. As you may have imagined, all it does is just removing the property from our scope. Okay, so we're deleting the property, and that's all we have to do to close the form. So if we now load the page again, you can see there's no form in the beginning. When we click things, it adds the class. That there's no form is just because the class is not there, and our CSS, like my CSS, is handling the displaying and hiding of it. But it's a very nice way of doing exactly that. So we can close that. And now look closely. When we change the name, it will immediately update in the list above and will immediately change the order. So if I change it to Z, it will go down the list. Or if I change it to C, it will go to the middle. So that's all done by Angular for us, all done in real time and automatically, and also works for larger collections. And this is why I showed you the whole function thing in the first place, because actually that is pretty awesome. And the reason why Angular can do it is called digest loop. And what a lot of other frameworks struggle to do is match the connection of functions to properties. So there's no way for Angular to tell if you've changed a property, it could then affect all your functions. Or if you call a function, it could each time change the property to some random value. So there's basically like a never-ending updating thing. And in a lot of other frameworks, you have to tell the framework, okay, this property, when it changes, please also update this function. If this function changes, it also means those two properties change. You don't have to do any of that in Angular. It handles everything for you. And the way it does it, it's very simply, like, simplified way of telling it is that. So you get some kind of what they call stimulus function, which is just something that changes the model and Angular is aware of. And then the model change will happen. So for example, we are changing the first name. And that model change will then pass on to what they call a watch list. A watch list is just a list of all the expressions we used in our view to display information or to handle clicks or to whatever, like hide and show things. And if that watch list, that checks for changes. If it detects a change, it will update the DOM and then run that loop again until it does not detect any changes anymore. So if you have like nested functions that call each other and change each other, there's no problem. Angular can handle that for you. Digest that. It's pretty awesome if you look at all the other frameworks. So we're coming to an end. If you want to dive into that a little bit more, I would really recommend to you to check out the website. It's pretty awesome. They have good documentation. There are still places in the documentation where it just says blah, blah, blah at the bottom, and there's just the piece missing. But the Google folks are working on that. They also have a Freenode IRC channel, which you should check out. They have a very awesome project on GitHub. It's called the Angular Seed, which is basically an example application you can just download and start hacking on and build your own stuff upon. And they also have a lot of cool meetups, which are all because Google is YouTube and they just do that. So you can watch very, very good and very deep technical videos on it, as well as very high-level overviews of it. So if you want to do that, do it. And if you're coming from a Ruby mentality or Ruby background, you should check out my project, Angular CRB. That's just like the Angular seed, which comes with Angular, and then a CoffeeScript compiler and less and SCSS and whatever you want. So it's a little bit more convenient to write that. If you're a Ruby guy, you can check that. Cool. So that's basically it. Before you leave, follow me on GitHub and on Twitter. Seriously, do that. And if you've done that and you like me, you can also hire me for whatever you want, basically. I will do everything. And yeah, that's it.